A dying rancher left a homeless Navy SEAL a ruined guest house, but his dog uncovered a crime buried for 40 years. At 64, homeless Navy SEAL Ethan Walker expected nothing from life except another cold night in his pickup truck beside his loyal K9 Shadow. Then a lawyer handed him a rusted key and ownership of a forgotten guest house deep in the Colorado Rockies. Everyone laughed at the inheritance. But when Shadow began digging into secrets hidden behind its walls, Ethan uncovered a trail of lies, betrayal, and a truth powerful men had spent 4 decades trying to bury. Comment 1 if you believe the truth always comes out, or 0 if you think some secrets stay buried forever. And tell us where you're watching from. The snow had started falling before sunrise. By mid-morning, Silver Creek looked as though someone had draped a white blanket over every rooftop, every pine tree, every fence post in town. The mountains surrounding the valley stood beneath low gray clouds, their peaks hidden behind curtains of drifting snow. Ethan Walker drove slowly down Main Street in a faded blue pickup truck that had seen better decades. The heater barely worked. The windshield rattled when the wind struck it. A crack stretched across the passenger side glass, like a lightning bolt frozen in time. In the seat beside him sat Shadow. The old German shepherd rested his head near the window, watching the town pass by with calm amber eyes. His muzzle had gone gray. His movements were slower than they had once been. But there was still something unmistakably powerful about him. The same intelligence, the same discipline. The same quiet watchfulness that had helped keep Ethan alive years ago. Ethan reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears. Shadow lifted his head slightly. That was enough. Neither of them needed much these days. The law office stood at the end of the block, a brick building with dark windows and a brass sign that read, Harrison, Brenner and Coleman Attorneys at Law. Ethan parked along the curb and shut off the engine. For several seconds, he simply sat there. The truck suddenly felt very quiet. He stared through the windshield at the falling snow. 3 years. 3 years since Linda had died. 3 years since cancer had slowly taken everything from both of them. The treatments, the hospital bills, the mortgage, the savings, the future they had planned, all gone. He still remembered the last night. Her hand in his, the smell of antiseptic, the steady beeping of monitors. The way she had smiled even when she knew, especially when she knew. You'll be okay, Ethan. That had been her final promise. He had not believed her then. Some days he still didn't. A soft nudge against his arm brought him back. Shadow. The dog looked at him patiently, waiting, just like he always did. Ethan managed a faint smile. Yeah, buddy. He opened the truck door. Let's get this over with. The cold hit immediately, sharp and clean. The kind of mountain air that made your lungs feel smaller. Shadow jumped down beside him. Together they crossed the sidewalk and entered the building. Warm air greeted them, along with silence and stares. The receptionist glanced up from her desk. Her eyes moved from Ethan's worn coat to his scuffed boots, then to Shadow. Something changed in her expression. Not hostility, something worse. Pity. Ethan hated pity. The receptionist cleared her throat. Mr. Walker? That's me. They're waiting upstairs. She pointed toward a staircase. Ethan nodded. Shadow followed close beside him. The second-floor conference room was already crowded. The moment Ethan stepped through the door, conversation stopped. Every face turned toward him. He recognized most of them. Distant cousins. Family members he hadn't spoken to in years. People who attended weddings and funerals and little else. At the center sat a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit. Russell Walker, Harold's eldest son, 62 years old, owner of multiple ranches, owner of half the valley, according to local rumor. Russell looked Ethan up and down. The expression on his face carried the same message everyone else in the room seemed to share. You don't belong here. Ethan wasn't surprised. He hadn't belonged anywhere in a long time. A lawyer rose from his chair, tall, thin, silver-haired. Mr. Walker, he extended a hand. My name is Daniel Brenner. Ethan shook it. The lawyer glanced briefly toward Shadow. Your uncle specifically requested that the dog be allowed inside. A few eyebrows rose around the table. That surprised Ethan. Harold had always liked Shadow, but that had been years ago. Back when Ethan still had a house, back when life still resembled something normal. Ethan took a seat near the back wall. Shadow settled beside him immediately. The room fell silent. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Daniel opened a folder. We are gathered today for the reading of Harold Walker's final will and testament. His voice carried the calm precision of a man who spent his life choosing words carefully. For the next 20 minutes, names were called, properties were assigned, investments distributed, land transferred. Russell inherited 2 large cattle ranches. His sister inherited commercial property near Denver. Another cousin inherited mineral rights. Someone else received vacation homes, money, businesses, assets, thousands of acres. The list seemed endless. Ethan listened without much interest. He had never expected anything. Harold had always been distant, not cruel, just distant. The old rancher had spent most of his life alone in the mountains. Nobody had ever fully understood him, least of all Ethan. Finally, Daniel turned a page. And to my nephew, Ethan Walker. Several heads shifted. The room suddenly became interested. I leave the property located at 47 Black Pine Hollow Road. Silence, Daniel continued. The guest house and all structures attached thereto. Nobody spoke for exactly 3 seconds. Then Russell laughed, a loud, genuine laugh, the kind that escaped before a man remembered he was supposed to be polite. Several others joined him. Not because the joke was especially funny, because they wanted Russell to see them laughing. Ethan had seen the same thing happen in military units. People followed power. It was human nature. Russell leaned back in his chair. The guest house? Another laugh. You mean that old wreck up in Black Pine? A cousin snorted. That place should have collapsed 20 years ago. Someone else added, it doesn't even have electricity. More laughter. The sound rolled through the room. Not cruel enough to be obvious. Not kind enough to be accidental. Just enough to remind Ethan exactly where he stood. At the bottom. Again, Russell shook his head. Dad always did have a strange sense of humor. The laughter grew louder. Ethan remained still. Years earlier, comments like that might have bothered him. Now, they simply felt familiar. War had taught him many things. One lesson above all. People revealed themselves when they thought someone had already lost. Across the room, Daniel Brenner never laughed. He simply waited. Eventually, the room quieted. The lawyer closed the folder. The will has now been fully executed. Chairs began moving. Conversations resumed. People gathered coats. Phones appeared. The inheritance had already become business. Ethan stood. So did Shadow. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked him questions. Nobody congratulated him. Why would they? He had inherited a ruin. As Ethan reached the door, Daniel spoke. Mr. Walker. Ethan turned. The lawyer approached carrying something in his hand. A small, rusted key. Ancient, corroded, dark with age. Daniel held it out. Your uncle left instructions. Ethan accepted it. The metal felt cold against his palm. There was also this. The lawyer handed him a folded envelope. Ethan opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only 7 words. Written in Harold Walker's unmistakable handwriting. Trust the dog. He sees what I never could. Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. Behind him, someone chuckled. Guess the dog inherited something too. More laughter. Ethan ignored it. His eyes remained fixed on the note. Trust the dog. He sees what I never could. Strange words. Harold had never been sentimental. Never mysterious. At least not that Ethan remembered. Daniel lowered his voice. Your uncle made me promise something. Ethan looked up. What? The lawyer hesitated, as though unsure whether he should say it. Finally he spoke. The last time I saw Harold alive, he told me one thing. Daniel glanced toward Shadow, then back to Ethan. He said someday the right man and the right dog would find the truth. The room suddenly felt colder. Ethan frowned. What truth? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. For a moment, neither man spoke. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the windows. Then Shadow stood. Without warning, the old shepherd walked forward, straight toward Daniel. The lawyer froze. Shadow sniffed the air. Once, twice. then gently touched the rusted key with his nose and stepped back. Daniel stared, Ethan stared. The dog simply sat down again, calm, patient, as though nothing unusual had happened. A strange feeling moved through Ethan, small, faint, easy to dismiss, yet impossible to ignore. The feeling that something had just begun, not ended. Brenner seemed to feel it too. Your uncle believed in that dog. Ethan glanced at Shadow. So do I. The lawyer nodded slowly. Then maybe you should see the guest house before deciding what it's worth. Ethan slipped the key into his pocket, folded the note, turned toward the door. The laughter behind him had faded. The conversations continued. The inheritance was already forgotten, at least to everyone else. But as Ethan and Shadow descended the stairs together, he could not shake the image of Harold's final message. Trust the dog. Outside, the storm had intensified. Snow swirled across Main Street. The mountains beyond town had vanished completely behind a curtain of white. Shadow paused on the sidewalk. The old shepherd lifted his head. For a moment he stared toward the distant Rockies, toward Black Pine Hollow, toward a guest house nobody wanted, toward a secret nobody yet understood. Then he took a single step forward, and Ethan followed. Neither of them knew that before winter ended, everything they believed about Harold Walker, Caleb Thornton, and the entire history of Silver Creek would be turned upside down. Neither of them knew that powerful men would soon become desperate, or that a truth buried for 40 years was already waiting. Patient, silent, hidden behind walls, waiting for a soldier and his dog to find it, waiting for the right key, waiting for them. The words stayed with Ethan Walker all the way out of Silver Creek. Snow swept across the highway in long white ribbons, chasing his pickup through the valley and into the mountains. The farther he drove from town, the fewer signs of civilization remained. Storefronts disappeared. Gas stations vanished. Cell service faded until his phone displayed a single empty bar before going completely silent. By late afternoon, he was alone with the mountains, just the way he usually preferred it most days. Today was different. Today there was a destination, Black Pine Hollow, the place nobody wanted, the place Harold Walker had left behind. Shadow sat upright beside him, unusually alert. The old German shepherd rarely paid attention to scenery. Years of military training had taught him to remain calm during long drives. But now his ears remained forward. His eyes followed every bend in the road, every stand of pine trees, every snow-covered ridge. It was as if he were searching for something, or remembering something. Ethan glanced over. You recognize this place, buddy? Shadow didn't react, but he never took his eyes off the mountains. The road climbed steadily. The valley narrowed. Dark forests crowded closer. The sky grew heavier. Then Ethan saw the sign. Black Pine Hollow Road. The wooden marker leaned crooked beneath years of weather and neglect. A narrow dirt road disappeared into the trees. Snow covered most of it. No tire tracks, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been here recently. Ethan slowed. For a moment, he considered turning around. The thought surprised him. He had spent years walking toward danger without hesitation. Combat zones, night operations, enemy territory. Yet a forgotten mountain road somehow felt more intimidating. Maybe because this wasn't danger, it was uncertainty, and uncertainty had become harder to face with age. Shadow suddenly stood. His front paws pressed against the dashboard. His tail gave a single slow wag. Ethan stared. That was unusual. Very unusual. The dog almost never showed excitement anymore. Not since retirement. Not since the arthritis began slowing him down. Yet now something had clearly caught his attention. All right. Ethan turned the wheel. Let's see what your friend Harold left us. The truck crawled forward. Branches scraped the sides. Snow crunched beneath the tires. The road wound deeper into the wilderness, past frozen streams, past rocky outcroppings, past towering pines that blocked most of the fading daylight. The deeper they traveled, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no voices, no engines, nothing. Only wind. After 20 minutes, the trees finally opened. A valley appeared, small, hidden, beautiful, and forgotten. The guest house sat near the center. Ethan stopped the truck. For several seconds, he simply stared. The place looked even worse than the family had described. The porch sagged dangerously. Half the roof shingles were missing. Broken windows stared like empty eyes. Snow had drifted against the walls. One side of the chimney leaned slightly. The entire structure looked exhausted, as if it had spent years waiting for permission to finally collapse. A smaller shed stood nearby. Beyond it flowed a narrow creek partially frozen beneath sheets of ice. The mountains surrounded everything, silent guardians watching from every direction. Shadow barked once. The sound echoed through the valley. Ethan smiled despite himself. Yeah. He opened the door. I see it. Cold air rushed in. They stepped into knee-deep snow. For a moment, Ethan simply stood there, looking, listening, breathing. Something felt different here. Not mysterious, not threatening, just different. The kind of feeling that settled deep in your chest before you could explain it. The same feeling he'd experienced years ago while establishing temporary camps in remote places. The sense that a location had a story, a history, a memory. The guest house seemed filled with all three. Shadow moved ahead immediately, not toward the front door, not toward the shed. He began circling the property, methodically, professionally, the way military dogs searched an area. Ethan watched with growing curiosity. The dog checked corners, examined fence lines, stopped occasionally to sniff the air, then continued. Almost like an inspection. Well, Ethan chuckled softly. Looks like you're in charge. The dog ignored him. Ethan approached the porch. The first step groaned beneath his weight. The second cracked. The third barely held. He climbed carefully. The front door stood crooked in its frame. The rusted key slid into the lock surprisingly easily. A loud click echoed inside. Then silence. Ethan pushed. The door opened slowly. Dust drifted through a beam of pale winter sunlight. The smell hit him immediately. Old wood, cold stone, time. Nobody had lived here for years. Maybe decades. He stepped inside. Shadow followed. The interior was surprisingly intact. Not comfortable, but intact. An old stone fireplace dominated the main room. Furniture remained beneath white sheets. Bookshelves lined one wall. A staircase climbed toward a second floor. Everything was covered in dust. Yet nothing appeared vandalized. Nothing appeared disturbed. The house had simply been forgotten. Ethan walked slowly, studying details. A coffee mug remained on a table. A blanket hung over a chair. Several framed photographs sat above the fireplace. All turned face down. That struck him as odd. Very odd. Shadow continued moving, room to room, hallway to hallway, searching. When Ethan entered the kitchen, he found a handwritten note attached to a cabinet. Welcome back. Nothing else. No signature, no explanation. Just 2 words. A chill moved across his shoulders. Harold's handwriting, he recognized it immediately. The note looked decades old, yet somehow it felt recent, personal, intentional, as if Harold had expected someone specific to find it. Someone like him. Ethan folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. Outside, darkness began creeping across the valley. Snow continued falling. The temperature dropped rapidly. He knew enough about mountain winters to recognize the situation. Leaving now would be foolish. Driving unfamiliar roads after dark during a storm was how people ended up stranded. Or worse. Looks like we're staying. Shadow barked once. Agreement. The old routine returned quickly. Years of military service had taught Ethan how to make difficult places livable. He gathered firewood from beneath a covered lean-to, cleaned the fireplace, found old lanterns, checked windows, secured doors. Within an hour, flames danced inside the stone hearth. Warm light filled the room. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to comfort. Not happiness, not yet, but comfort. He heated canned soup over the fire, shared pieces of beef jerky with Shadow. Outside, the storm strengthened. Wind howled through the trees. Snow rattled against the glass. The mountains disappeared completely. Inside, the fire crackled. The old house settled around them. Ethan leaned back in a worn armchair. Shadow stretched across the rug. For a long time, neither moved. The silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Then Ethan noticed something. Shadow wasn't sleeping. The dog was staring, not at the fire, Not at the windows, at the hallway. His entire body had become still, focused, watching. Ethan followed his gaze. The hallway remained dark. Nothing moved. What is it? Shadow slowly stood. His ears lifted, his posture changed. The old soldier was suddenly alert. Then, without warning, he walked toward the hallway, toward the rear of the house. Ethan watched him disappear around a corner. Several seconds passed. Then he heard it. A scratch, soft, deliberate, another, then silence. Ethan stood, crossed the room, followed the sound. The hallway ended near a closed bedroom door. Shadow sat directly in front of it, watching, waiting. The dog looked up as Ethan approached, then looked back at the door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A quiet sound, almost polite, as though asking permission. Ethan frowned. The door wasn't locked. He opened it. The bedroom appeared ordinary. Dust, old furniture, a bed, a wardrobe. Nothing unusual, nothing hidden, nothing threatening. Shadow entered anyway. He walked slowly around the room, sniffed corners, examined walls, then stopped beside the wardrobe. He stared at it for nearly a full minute, without moving, without blinking. Then he sat down. Ethan waited. Nothing happened. Eventually he sighed. Whatever you're seeing, buddy, I'm not seeing it. Shadow continued staring. The fire crackled faintly somewhere down the hall. Wind rattled the windows. The room remained silent, yet as Ethan looked around, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not dangerous, not obvious, just wrong. Like a puzzle missing one piece. Eventually, he guided Shadow back toward the living room. The dog came willingly, but before leaving, he looked over his shoulder one final time, toward the wardrobe, toward the wall behind it, as if something important remained there, something waiting. Later that night, Ethan lay on an old couch near the fire. Shadow slept beside him, or appeared to. Outside the storm raged. Inside the house remained warm, safe, quiet. For the first time in months, Ethan drifted into sleep without fighting it, without alcohol, without exhaustion, without fear. Yet just before darkness claimed him completely, he remembered Harold's note. Trust the dog. He sees what I never could. Ethan stared into the fire, then toward the hallway, toward the bedroom, toward the strange place Shadow couldn't stop watching. A faint unease settled over him. Not fear, expectation. The feeling that the old house was holding its breath, waiting, just as the lawyer had said, waiting for the right man and the right dog to finally start asking questions. Questions nobody else had ever bothered to ask. The storm continued through the night. Wind pushed against the old guest house with long, mournful sighs. Snow tapped against the windows. The fire in the stone fireplace burned low, casting shifting shadows across the ceiling. Ethan slept. At least his body did. His mind traveled elsewhere. The dream came the same way it always did. Darkness, a helicopter, the smell of fuel, voices over a headset, then gunfire, sudden, violent, close. The familiar chaos unfolded around him. A younger version of himself ran through dust and smoke. Commands echoed. Someone shouted his name. A flash of light. A teammate falling, blood, confusion, failure. The dream twisted. The battlefield changed. Now it was a hospital room. Linda lay in bed, pale, fragile, smiling anyway. Machines beeped softly beside her. Ethan reached for her hand, but she seemed farther away than before. Every step toward her only increased the distance. Ethan. Her voice sounded faint, like an echo. Ethan. He tried to answer. Couldn't. His chest tightened. The room darkened. The machines began screaming. Ethan. Suddenly something slammed into him. Hard. The dream shattered. Ethan bolted upright, breathing heavily, heart racing. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cold room. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then reality returned. The fireplace, the couch, the guest house, the mountains, Shadow. The German shepherd stood beside him, front paws pressed against the couch. Eyes locked on Ethan. The dog had awakened him again, just as he had done countless times over the years. Some nightmares never truly disappeared. They simply became part of the landscape, like old scars. Shadow nudged Ethan's shoulder, a firm push, grounding him, bringing him back. Ethan placed a trembling hand on the dog's neck. The thick fur felt reassuring. Real, present. I'm okay. His voice sounded rough. Shadow remained unconvinced. The dog watched him carefully, then suddenly turned and walked toward the hallway. Ethan frowned. The same hallway, the same bedroom, the same place Shadow refused to forget. The dog stopped halfway down the corridor, looked back, waiting, almost inviting him. "You've got to be kidding." Shadow simply stared, then disappeared around the corner. Ethan sighed. Outside, the storm still raged. Inside, the old house creaked softly. He grabbed a lantern, followed. The hallway seemed longer at night, darker. The lantern light revealed faded wallpaper and dust-covered photographs hanging slightly, crooked on the walls. The bedroom door stood open. Shadow was already inside, waiting beside the wardrobe. Again, exactly where he had been earlier. The dog scratched once, paws, then sat down. His eyes never left the wall behind the furniture. Ethan stepped closer. The wardrobe was enormous, solid oak, ancient, probably weighed several hundred pounds. He studied it carefully. Nothing unusual. At least not initially. Then he noticed something. The dust. Every surface in the room carried a thick layer of it, except one narrow section near the floor behind the wardrobe. There, the dust appeared disturbed. Recently, Ethan crouched. His military instincts immediately awakened. Years of training had taught him to notice small inconsistencies, tiny details others ignored. The disturbed area wasn't natural. Something had moved. Maybe years ago, maybe recently, but definitely moved. He slowly stood. Interesting. Shadow's tail moved once. The dog seemed almost pleased. Ethan grabbed one side of the wardrobe. Pushed. Nothing. The thing barely shifted. He repositioned himself. Used both hands, applied more force. The old furniture groaned. Wood scraped against wood, slowly, very slowly. The wardrobe moved several inches. Dust exploded into the air. Shadow immediately stepped forward. The dog's attention sharpened. Every muscle in his body became focused. Ethan raised the lantern. The wall behind the wardrobe came into view. Then he froze. There were scratches. Not random marks, deliberate ones. Thin grooves cut into the wooden paneling, almost invisible beneath decades of dust. At first they looked meaningless. Then Ethan leaned closer. The scratches formed shapes, symbols, letters. Someone had carved words into the wall. Time had faded them, but they remained. Ethan brushed away dust with his sleeve. The message slowly appeared. "If you found this," the remaining letters were nearly impossible to read. Age had damaged them. Yet enough survived. "If you found this, trust Shadow." Ethan stared. A chill traveled through him. Shadow. Not a dog. The dog. His dog. The dog Harold had mentioned in the note. The dog Harold apparently expected. But how? Harold died months ago. The carving looked decades old. None of it made sense. None of it should have been possible. Shadow suddenly began sniffing near the floorboards. Intensely. Rapidly. Back and forth. Then he pawed at one specific section, a narrow strip near the corner. Ethan lowered the lantern. The wood looked normal, except for one detail, a tiny metal nail, unlike every other nail in the room. Different shape, different age, almost hidden, almost invisible. The sort of thing nobody would notice unless they were looking very carefully. Or unless a highly trained military dog refused to stop pointing at it. Ethan sat back on his heels. His pulse quickened, not from fear, from anticipation. Something was here, something important. The realization settled slowly. Harold hadn't left him a house. Harold had left him a puzzle, and Shadow seemed determined to solve it. The old seal smiled despite himself. For the first time in years, he felt something awakening inside him. Purpose, mission, direction. The feelings felt strangely familiar. Like muscles that hadn't been used in a very long time. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. Inside, Ethan examined the floor carefully. The boards looked old, original, yet one section appeared slightly different. The seams weren't perfectly aligned. Someone had worked here, long ago, very carefully, very deliberately. The old dog sat beside him, patient, certain, as though he already knew the answer. Eventually, Ethan stood. The hour was late. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and whatever waited beneath those boards had remained hidden for decades. One more night wouldn't matter. Tomorrow, He looked down at Shadow. First thing tomorrow. The dog blinked. Nothing more. Yet somehow Ethan got the feeling Shadow approved. They returned to the living room. The fire had nearly burned out. Ethan added another log. Flames rose again. Warm light filled the room, but sleep came slowly. Questions kept circling his mind. How did Harold know about Shadow? Why leave that strange note? Why hide messages inside walls? Why leave a worthless guest house to a man everyone else considered broken? Near midnight, Ethan finally drifted asleep. The house remained quiet. The storm gradually weakened. Moonlight eventually broke through gaps in the clouds. Silver light spread across the valley, across the snow, across the old guest house, and inside the bedroom, behind the shifted wardrobe, hidden beyond the wall, and beneath the floorboards, something waited. Something preserved through 40 years of silence. Something Harold Walker had protected for most of his life. The next morning arrived bright and clear. The storm was gone. Fresh snow covered everything. The mountains sparkled beneath sunlight. For a brief moment, the valley looked untouched by the world. Peaceful, timeless. Ethan stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The cold air filled his lungs. Shadow stood beside him, watching the tree line, watching the mountains, watching, always watching. Then the dog suddenly turned, not toward the forest, not toward the road, toward the bedroom. His ears lifted. His body became alert again. And for the first time, Ethan realized something important. Shadow wasn't curious. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't exploring. The dog was trying to show him something. Something specific. Something real. And judging by the determination in those amber eyes, Shadow wasn't going to stop until Ethan finally understood. Whatever had been hidden inside Black Pine Hollow, whatever secret Harold Walker had spent decades protecting, whatever truth powerful people apparently wanted forgotten, they were getting closer, much closer, and somewhere beneath that old floor, behind that hidden wall, the first real answer was waiting. The morning sun hung low over Black Pine Hollow. Fresh snow covered the valley in untouched white. The mountains gleamed beneath a cloudless sky. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, Ethan Walker felt the same sensation he remembered before important missions. The feeling that something hidden was finally within reach. He stood in the bedroom doorway, holding a pry bar he had found in the shed. Shadow was already inside, waiting beside the wardrobe, waiting beside the strange section of floor. The dog looked up at Ethan once, then back at the boards. Ethan shook his head. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor. That was answer enough. For the next 20 minutes, Ethan worked. The wardrobe was moved completely aside. Dust rose into the air. Sunlight filtered through the dirty window, illuminating particles that drifted like tiny stars. The old punt floorboards looked ordinary at first glance, but the more Ethan studied them, the more obvious the differences became. The grain didn't match. The nails were newer. The seams weren't perfectly aligned. Someone had altered this section, deliberately, carefully, years ago. Ethan crouched beside the corner. The pry bar slid beneath the first board. Wood groaned. The sound echoed through the room. Shadow immediately stood. His ears rose. Every muscle tightened. The old dog looked younger somehow. Focused, alert, driven. Ethan applied pressure. The board resisted, then suddenly gave way. A sharp crack echoed through the room. The board lifted. Darkness appeared beneath it. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, from anticipation. He removed a second board, then a third. A square opening slowly emerged, roughly 3 feet wide, 3 feet long. A hidden compartment, exactly where Shadow had been pointing all along. The cavity beneath the floor was surprisingly deep, almost 4 feet, carefully constructed, completely concealed, and inside sat something wrapped in a faded military tarp. Ethan stared. The tarp looked old, very old, yet it remained intact. Protected from moisture, protected from time, protected from discovery, until now. Shadow moved closer. He sniffed once, then sat beside the opening, watching, waiting. Ethan carefully reached down. The bundle was heavier than expected. He lifted it onto the floor. Dust scattered across the room. The tarp crackled as he unfolded it. Inside was a metal ammunition box, military issue, dark green, rust-spotted, heavy, very heavy. Ethan immediately recognized it. He had carried similar containers during deployments decades earlier. The sight alone stirred memories. Airfields, supply depots, operations conducted in darkness. Another life, another version of himself. A small brass lock secured the box. Ethan froze. The rusted key, Harold's key, the one from the lawyer's office. His hand moved instinctively to his pocket. The key remained there, cold, solid, waiting, just as the lawyer had said. Waiting for the right person. Ethan slid the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a soft metallic click. The lock opened. Neither Ethan nor Shadow moved. The silence felt enormous. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, Ethan lifted the lid. The hinges creaked. Inside lay history, photographs, journals, cassette tapes, folders tied with string, military documents, maps, letters, everything arranged with extraordinary care, not hidden in panic, hidden with purpose. The sight sent a chill through Ethan. Whoever built this cache intended someone to find it eventually. Someone specific, someone trusted. At the very top rested a sealed envelope. His name appeared across the front. Ethan Walker. The handwriting was unmistakable. Harold's. Shadow whined softly. Ethan picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile with age, yet the seal remained unbroken. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The first line stopped him cold. "If you are reading this, Shadow was right." Ethan stared, then read it again. "If you are reading this, Shadow was right." His eyes moved down the page. "Nephew, I never trusted many people. That was my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. But I trusted dogs, especially military dogs. They notice what pride makes men ignore. If Shadow led you here, then I know I chose correctly. What you're about to uncover isn't an inheritance. It's a responsibility. Everything inside this box belongs to a man named Caleb Thornton. 40 years ago, Caleb lost everything. Most people believe they know why. Most people are wrong. The truth nearly destroyed lives. It nearly destroyed mine. And there are still people who would rather see it buried forever. Read everything. Trust your instincts and trust the dog. He'll find things no one else can." The room felt suddenly smaller. Ethan lowered the letter. His pulse hammered in his ears. Caleb Thornton. The name meant nothing to him. Yet Harold clearly believed it should. Shadow nudged the ammunition box. The dog seemed impatient, as though the real story hadn't started yet. Ethan almost laughed. "All right." He sat cross-legged on the floor. The old house groaned softly around him. Outside, sunlight sparkled across the snow-covered valley. Inside, 40 years of secrets waited. He picked up the first photograph. A younger Harold stood beside another man. Both wore cowboy hats. Both smiled. Behind them stretched thousands of acres of ranch land. The second man looked strong, confident, honest. The kind of man people trusted. Written across the back were 3 words: Harold and Caleb. The next photograph showed the same 2 men standing beside a newly constructed barn. Another showed them branding cattle. Another showed them fishing beside a mountain lake. Friends, partners, brothers in everything except blood. Ethan continued sorting through the pictures. Then he noticed something strange. The photographs ended abruptly. The final image had been taken around 40 years earlier. After that, nothing. No more pictures, no more memories, as though Caleb Thornton had vanished from existence. The realization settled heavily. That wasn't normal. People didn't simply disappear from every photograph, unless someone wanted them forgotten. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the window. The dog listened carefully. Ethan looked up. Silence. Nothing then a distant engine. Very faint. Somewhere beyond the valley. A vehicle. The first one he'd heard since arriving. Shadow continued listening. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, but Ethan recognized the posture. Observation. Assessment. Military habits never completely disappeared. The sound eventually faded. Whoever it was had continued down another road, yet the interruption left Ethan uneasy. Someone else existed beyond Black Pine Hollow. Someone connected to the world outside. A world Harold clearly distrusted. Ethan returned his attention to the box. Beneath the photographs lay several journals. Their covers were worn, edges faded. Thousands of pages waited inside. A lifetime of notes. A lifetime of observations. A lifetime of secrets. And underneath everything else sat one final object. A cassette tape. Unlike the others, it carried a label. Written in Harold's handwriting, "Play this first." Ethan stared at it. A tape recorder rested nearby, packed carefully inside the box, ready, waiting, just like everything else. The old soldier slowly exhaled. He had expected a ruined guest house, maybe a place to spend a few quiet months. Instead, he had found a hidden vault, a dead man's investigation, a missing rancher, and a mystery buried for 4 decades. Outside, sunlight flooded the valley. Inside, the first layer of truth had finally been uncovered. But Ethan already knew one thing. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous this story was going to become. And somehow, Shadow had known it from the very beginning. The old German shepherd rested beside the open ammunition box, calm, certain, as if he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. For the box, for the letters, for the photographs, for the truth. And somewhere inside those journals, Ethan sensed the answer to a question he hadn't even known to ask. Who was Caleb Thornton? And why had Harold Walker spent 40 years hiding his story from the world? The answer waited in the pages ahead, waiting to finally be heard. The fire burned steadily through the afternoon. Outside, sunlight glittered across the snow-covered valley. The mountains stood silent beyond the windows, their white peaks glowing beneath the winter sky. Inside the guest house, Ethan Walker sat on the floor beside the open ammunition box. Shadow rested nearby. The old German shepherd appeared calm, but every so often his eyes drifted toward the journals, as if he understood their importance, as if he knew they contained something that mattered. Ethan picked up the first notebook. The cover was worn leather, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, Harold Walker's handwriting filled every line. Precise, careful, methodical. The entries began more than 40 years earlier, spring 1981. The first page contained a simple sentence. Today, Caleb and I bought the North Pasture. Someday this valley will feed our grandchildren. Ethan turned the page, then another and another. Slowly, a story emerged. A story about 2 men, 2 friends, 2 dreamers, Harold Walker and Caleb Thornton. Together they had built one of the largest cattle operations in western Colorado. Neither man had inherited wealth. Neither came from powerful families. Everything they owned had been earned. Fence post by fence post, calf by calf, season by season. The journals described long days beneath the mountain sun, snowstorms that nearly wiped out entire herds, drought years, good years, bad years, victories, failures. And through every entry, one thing remained constant: trust. Harold trusted Caleb completely. The words appeared again and again. Best partner I ever had. Best friend I ever had. Brother in everything except blood. Ethan paused. The emotion in Harold's writing surprised him. The old rancher had never seemed sentimental. Yet every page revealed deep affection, deep respect, something powerful, something rare. Shadow slowly stood. The dog approached a stack of photographs. His nose touched one gently. Ethan picked it up. The image showed Caleb Thornton standing beside a horse. He looked to be in his 40s. Broad shoulders, dark hair, easy smile. The face of a man comfortable in his own skin. The face of someone people naturally trusted. Ethan studied the picture, then looked back at the journals. The next entry changed everything. August 12, 1983. Something is wrong. That was all Harold wrote at first. The following pages became increasingly tense. Caleb had begun arguing with local officials. Property boundaries were suddenly being questioned. Old records had started disappearing. Government survey maps no longer matched previous versions. Tax documents contained strange inconsistencies. At first the problems seemed small, annoying, nothing more. Then they grew. A neighbor suddenly claimed ownership of grazing land that had belonged to Caleb for years. A county inspector appeared without warning. Fines followed. Legal notices followed. Pressure increased. Harold wrote, "Someone wants Caleb gone." Ethan sat back. The room suddenly felt colder. He continued reading. Months passed. The situation worsened. More accusations appeared. Rumors spread through town. People began whispering. Questions became judgments. Judgments became facts. Then came the accusation that changed everything. Theft. According to official records, thousands of dollars had vanished from a business account. The evidence appeared overwhelming. The town turned against Caleb almost overnight. Friends disappeared. Neighbors stopped speaking to him. Local newspapers printed accusations. No one waited for proof. No one asked questions. They simply decided guilty. Ethan frowned. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The man described in these journals didn't fit the accusations. The picture didn't fit. The friendship didn't fit. Nothing fit. Shadow suddenly whined. A soft sound, almost sad. Ethan glanced toward him. The dog had lowered his head onto his paws. His eyes remained fixed on Caleb's photograph. "You don't believe it either, huh?" Shadow blinked. Ethan returned to the journal. The entries grew darker. Harold described trying to defend his friend, trying to convince people to wait, to investigate, to ask questions. Nobody listened. Fear was easier. Rumors were easier. Then came the entry that changed everything. October 3, 1984. Caleb is gone. Only 4 words, nothing more. The next page contained a longer explanation. Caleb Thornton had disappeared. His truck was found abandoned near a highway outside town. No sign of violence, no note, no goodbye, nothing. The official conclusion came quickly. Caleb had stolen money and fled. Case closed. Most of Silver Creek accepted the explanation immediately. Harold did not. The following pages carried a different tone. Anger, confusion, determination. Harold listed inconsistencies, questions, facts that didn't add up. Why would Caleb abandon everything? Why leave behind his cattle? Why leave behind his home? Why leave behind people he loved? The more Harold investigated, the more convinced he became. Caleb had not run. Something else had happened. Something nobody wanted examined too closely. Ethan slowly lowered the journal. The room had grown quiet. Only the crackling fire broke the silence. Outside, afternoon shadows stretched across the valley. Inside, the mystery deepened. A man had vanished. A town had accepted the explanation. One friend had refused. And for 40 years, Harold Walker had continued searching. The realization settled heavily. This wasn't merely an old story. It was an unfinished one. Shadow suddenly rose again. The dog walked toward the window. His ears lifted. His posture stiffened. Ethan immediately noticed. Years together had taught him to trust those signals. Something had caught Shadow's attention. Ethan moved beside him. Through the glass he saw a vehicle, far away, near the entrance road. A black pickup, almost too distant to identify. It sat motionless, watching the valley, watching the guest house. A strange feeling moved through Ethan. The truck remained there for several seconds, then slowly turned around. Moments later, disappeared among the trees. Shadow continued staring long after it was gone. The old soldier inside Ethan awakened instantly. Observation, assessment, awareness. Whoever that was had not gotten lost. They had stopped deliberately. They had looked directly toward the guest house, and then they had left. Ethan glanced toward the journals, toward the photographs, toward the evidence hidden for decades. For the first time, Harold's warning truly landed. There are still people who would rather see it buried forever. A chill moved through him. Not fear, recognition. The same feeling he had experienced during missions overseas. The moment when a situation stopped being history and became present, dangerous, alive. Shadow finally stepped away from the window. He returned to Caleb's photograph, sat beside it, and rested one paw gently against the edge. The gesture was simple, yet somehow it felt meaningful, almost protective. Ethan picked up the photograph once more. He looked at Caleb Thornton's face, at the easy smile, at the confidence, at the life that had been erased. Then he opened the next journal, because he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Somewhere in these pages lay the reason Caleb Thornton vanished. Somewhere in these pages lay the beginning of a lie, powerful enough to survive 40 years. And somewhere beyond the valley, someone had just noticed that Harold Walker's guest house was no longer empty. The search had officially begun, and for the first time in decades, the truth finally had someone willing to listen. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. Clouds drifted low across the Rocky Mountains. The valley below Black Pine Hollow remained quiet, too quiet. Ethan Walker stood on the porch of the guest house, with a mug of coffee warming his hands. His eyes followed the tree line. The black pickup from yesterday was gone. No tracks remained except those partly covered by fresh, wind-blown snow. Yet he could not shake the feeling that someone had been watching. Shadow stood beside him. The old German shepherd faced the forest, alert, focused, listening. The dog had spent years detecting danger before humans noticed it. Age had slowed his body, it had not dulled his instincts. Ethan looked down. "You hear something I don't?" Shadow's ears twitched. Then suddenly he stepped off the porch, without hesitation, without looking back. The dog moved toward the far side of the property. Ethan grabbed his coat. "Guess we're working today." The morning became a march through forgotten ground. Shadow led. Ethan followed. The forest swallowed them quickly. Towering pines blocked much of the sunlight. Snow-covered fallen branches, animal tracks crossed the landscape. Elk, foxes, rabbits. But Shadow ignored all of them. He moved with purpose, as though following instructions only he could hear. Nearly half an hour passed before the dog stopped. They stood before an old fence line. Most of it had collapsed decades earlier. Rotting posts leaned at odd angles. Barbed wire disappeared beneath snow and brush. Ethan studied the area. Nothing seemed remarkable. Then Shadow began digging. Snow flew. Dirt scattered. Within seconds, metal appeared beneath the frozen ground. Ethan knelt. Using a small folding shovel from his backpack, he cleared away the remaining dirt. A survey marker emerged. Brass, weathered, official. He wiped away decades of grime. Letters became visible. Thornton, North Range. Ethan frowned. Thornton. Caleb Thornton. The name appeared again. The survey marker shouldn't have been here. Not according to modern property maps. At least not according to the maps Harold had stored in the ammunition box. Something didn't match. Someone had changed boundaries. The realization settled heavily. This wasn't random evidence. This was proof. Proof that land ownership once looked very different. Shadow barked once, then moved again. The hunt continued. By noon, they reached an abandoned barn hidden deep within the trees. Its roof had partially collapsed. Snow drifted through broken walls. The structure looked ready to surrender to gravity. Yet Shadow walked directly inside. Without hesitation, without fear, dust floated through beams of sunlight. Old ranch equipment rested where it had been abandoned decades earlier. Rust covered everything. Silence filled the space. Then Shadow stopped near a workbench. The dog sniffed intensely, back and forth. Again and again, Ethan examined the area. At first, he saw nothing. Then his eyes landed on a loose board beneath the bench. He pulled it aside. A small tin box sat underneath. His pulse quickened. The box opened easily. Inside were papers, old papers, property tax receipts, livestock records, insurance documents, all bearing the same name. Caleb Thornton. Ethan slowly exhaled. Harold had hidden evidence everywhere, not in one place, in dozens, like a man preparing for a long war. A war he expected to lose, unless someone eventually continued the fight. For the first time, Ethan truly understood the scale of what Harold had been doing. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't curiosity. This was an investigation. A 40-year investigation. The afternoon sun moved lower. The temperature dropped. Still, Shadow pushed onward. The old dog seemed tireless, driven by something deeper than training. As if every clue brought him closer to completing a mission. Near sunset, they reached a hunting cabin, or what remained of one. Only part of the structure still stood. Most had collapsed beneath years of snow and neglect. A faded sign hung beside the doorway. Thornton Creek Camp again. Thornton. Everywhere, the same name, the same ghost. Inside the cabin, they found another hidden cache. This one contained photographs, dozens of them. Caleb standing beside cattle. Caleb inspecting fences. Caleb shaking hands with local ranchers. Caleb attending community events. In every image he appeared respected, trusted, admired. Nothing about the photographs resembled the portrait of a criminal. Nothing. One picture caught Ethan's attention. Caleb stood beside another man, younger, tall, confident, expensively dressed. Written on the back were two names, Caleb Thornton, Richard Thornton. Ethan stared. Thornton, the same last name, a relative. And suddenly another piece clicked into place. Wade Thornton. The wealthy ranch owner Harold had referenced briefly in one of the journals. Caleb's nephew, the most powerful man in the valley. A strange unease moved through him. Family connections mattered in small towns, sometimes more than facts, sometimes more than truth. As they left the cabin, the sound of an engine echoed through the trees. Both Ethan and Shadow froze. The noise came from somewhere nearby, not close enough to see, close enough to hear. A vehicle moved slowly through the mountains, then stopped. Silence followed. Ethan listened. Nothing. No voices, no doors, just stillness. The old instincts returned immediately, awareness, positioning, observation. Shadow stood beside him. The dog's posture mirrored his own. Both understood something. Someone else was out here, watching, maybe hunting, maybe simply curious, but definitely interested. The feeling lingered all the way back to the guest house. Darkness settled across the valley before they returned. The mountains became black silhouettes against the evening sky. The fire crackled warmly inside. Ethan spread the day's discoveries across the kitchen table. Survey records, tax documents, photographs, maps, evidence, pieces of a puzzle, and every piece pointed in the same direction. Caleb Thornton had owned far more land than official records claimed. Far more. Someone had erased entire sections of his history. Someone had rewritten ownership. Someone had benefited enormously. Shadow rested beneath the table, exhausted but content. Ethan reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good work today, partner." The old shepherd lifted his head. His tail tapped the floor once. That simple gesture brought an unexpected ache to Ethan's chest. For years after Linda's death, every day had felt the same. Wake up, survive, sleep, repeat. No mission, no purpose, no direction. Now something had changed. For the first time in years, he woke each morning with a reason to move forward, a reason to keep looking, a reason to care. The realization surprised him. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Inside, Ethan opened one of Harold's journals. A folded note slipped from between the pages. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. "If you're reading this, you're getting close. The people who profited from Caleb's disappearance still own most of what he built. Follow the boundaries. Follow the land. The land never lies." Ethan stared at the message, then slowly looked toward the window, toward the darkness beyond, toward the valley, toward the powerful families who still controlled Silver Creek. And for the first time, one name rose above all the others. Wade Thornton, the richest rancher in the county, the most respected man in town, the man whose family seemed connected to every clue Shadow uncovered. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Wade Thornton was living comfortably inside a legacy everyone admired, a legacy that might have been built on stolen ground. Ethan closed the journal. The firelight flickered across the room. Shadow slept beside the table. Outside, unseen in the darkness beyond the valley, headlights briefly appeared on a distant ridge. A vehicle stopped, watching the guest house, watching the lights inside, watching Ethan Walker. Then the headlights disappeared, and the night swallowed them whole. The game had changed. The questions were becoming dangerous. And somewhere in Silver Creek, a powerful man was beginning to realize that Harold Walker's secrets had not died with him. The next morning, Ethan drove into town before sunrise. Snow still covered the sidewalks. The mountains glowed pale blue beneath the first light of day. Silver Creek looked peaceful from a distance. A postcard town, church steeples, historic storefronts, smoke rising from chimneys. The kind of place tourists imagined when they thought about small-town Colorado. But Ethan had spent enough years around people to know appearances could be deceiving. Some battlefields wore friendly faces. Shadow sat beside him in the truck. The old shepherd remained unusually alert. His eyes followed every passing vehicle, every pedestrian, every movement, as if he sensed the growing tension before Ethan fully understood it himself. Harold's journals had mentioned one person repeatedly during the final years of his investigation. A retired county clerk named Eleanor Briggs. If anyone still remembered the old property records, it would be her. Ethan found her house on the edge of town, a modest white cottage overlooking a frozen creek. Wind chimes moved gently beneath the porch roof. The woman who answered the door appeared to be in her late 70s. Sharp eyes, silver hair, the posture of someone who had spent her life refusing to be intimidated. She looked at Ethan, then at Shadow, then back at Ethan. "You must be Harold's nephew." The statement surprised him. "You know who I am?" She smiled faintly. "Small town." That explained everything. Eleanor invited them inside. The cottage smelled like coffee and old books. Photographs lined the walls, decades of memories captured in wooden frames. Ethan explained why he had come. He told her about the guest house, the hidden compartment, the journals, the photographs. As soon as he mentioned Caleb Thornton, something changed in her expression. Not surprise, recognition, and sadness. A deep sadness that seemed years old. She slowly sat down. For several moments she stared into her coffee cup. Finally she spoke. "I always wondered if Harold would find someone stubborn enough to finish this." Ethan leaned forward. "You knew about it?" "Not everything," she sighed, "but enough." Shadow rested beside her chair. The old dog watched quietly. Eleanor reached down and scratched behind his ears. "He reminds me of the dogs we used to see when the soldiers came through town." Shadow closed his eyes briefly. Then she looked back at Ethan. "What exactly do you want to know? The truth?" A faint smile touched her face. "Then you're asking for something expensive." She disappeared into another room. When she returned, she carried a worn cardboard box. Dust coated the lid. The box looked as though it had not been opened in years. Eleanor placed it on the table. Inside were maps, old county surveys, property records, tax assessments, documents dating back nearly 50 years. Ethan spent hours studying them, slowly, carefully, and as he compared the records, a pattern emerged. Same pattern Harold had suspected. Land ownership changed abruptly in the early 1980s. Boundaries shifted, names disappeared, new corporations appeared. Small transactions accumulated into something enormous. Thousands of acres quietly changed hands, always benefiting the same network of people, always connected somehow to the Thornton family. Ethan spread several maps across the table. The difference was unmistakable. One map showed Caleb Thornton controlling vast grazing land across the valley. A later version showed much of that land owned by newly formed companies. Companies that no longer existed. Companies with no employees, no offices, no visible purpose. Shell companies. The realization settled heavily. Someone had built an entire system. A machine designed to move ownership without attracting attention. Eleanor pointed toward one parcel. "That ranch belongs to Wade Thornton now." Then another, and that one. Then another, and that one. The list continued. Each answer felt like another piece of a puzzle sliding into place. By midday, Ethan sat back in silence. The evidence surrounded him. Maps, records, dates, signatures, a paper trail stretching across decades. And every road led toward the same conclusion. The Thornton fortune hadn't grown naturally. It had grown from something taken, something stolen, something hidden. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears became rigid. The old shepherd stood. Ethan immediately noticed. "What is it?" Shadow moved toward the window. Outside, a dark SUV had stopped across the street. The vehicle remained parked, engine running, windows tinted. The driver never exited, never looked away from the house. Eleanor followed Ethan's gaze. Her expression darkened. "They've been doing that for years." Ethan turned toward her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then answered carefully. Anyone who asks too many questions eventually notices they're not alone. The room fell silent. Outside, the SUV remained motionless, watching, waiting. After several minutes, it finally pulled away, slowly, deliberately, as though it wanted them to know it had been there. Ethan understood the message. He had received similar messages in other parts of the world. You are being noticed. Be careful. The difference was that those warnings usually came from enemies overseas, not respected businessmen in Colorado. Eleanor stood and walked to a bookshelf. She removed a single folder. Unlike the others, it was sealed. I promised Harold I wouldn't open this unless something happened to him. She handed it to Ethan. Something happened. The folder contained copies of correspondence Harold had collected over many years. Letters, property transfers, internal county communications. Nothing dramatic by itself, but together they painted a disturbing picture. People had known, not everyone, but enough. Officials had looked away. Records had vanished. Questions had been discouraged. The truth had been buried beneath paperwork and time. And at the center of everything stood one family, Thornton. By late afternoon, Ethan left Eleanor's cottage. The box of copies sat in the back seat beside Shadow. Snow drifted lazily through the air. The town seemed unchanged, normal, ordinary. Yet Ethan now saw it differently. Every building, every ranch, every business. He found himself wondering, how much of this was built on land that once belonged to Caleb Thornton? How many fortunes began with that disappearance? The drive back to Black Pine Hollow felt longer than usual. The mountains grew darker as evening approached. Clouds gathered over the peaks. A storm was coming. Halfway home, Ethan passed an enormous ranch entrance. Iron gates, stone pillars, a sign carved into polished granite. Thornton Ridge Ranch. The property stretched across the valley floor like a kingdom. Thousands of acres, expensive barns, modern equipment, luxury homes, success made visible. Ethan slowed briefly, then continued driving, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. The most respected family in the county, the wealthiest family, the most powerful family. Their empire appeared rooted in fraud. The realization was staggering and terrifying. Because powerful people rarely surrendered power willingly. By the time Ethan reached the guest house, darkness had settled over Black Pine Hollow. The first snowflakes of the new storm drifted through the trees. Shadow jumped from the truck, then froze. Every muscle in his body tightened. The old shepherd stared toward the porch. Ethan followed his gaze. Something was wrong. The front door stood slightly open, just an inch, maybe two. Yet Ethan knew with absolute certainty he had locked it. The cold wind moved through the gap. The door creaked softly, back and forth, back and forth. Shadow stepped in front of him, protective, silent, watching. Ethan felt the familiar calm that used to arrive before missions. The calm that appeared when training took over. Someone had been here. The question was simple. Had they found what they were looking for, or were they planning to come back? Snow began falling harder. The old guest house stood waiting in the darkness. And for the first time since arriving in Black Pine Hollow, Ethan realized the search was no longer hidden. Someone else knew he was asking questions. Someone else knew he was finding answers. And somewhere beyond the mountains, a powerful family had every reason to fear what came next. Because the truth was no longer buried. It was waking up. Snow swirled across Black Pine Hollow. The storm had arrived faster than expected. Wind pushed through the pines with a low, restless howl. Ethan stood motionless beside his truck. Shadow remained in front of him, focused on the guest house. The front door still hung slightly open. Back and forth, moving with the wind. Every instinct Ethan possessed told him the same thing. Someone had entered the house, recently. He placed a hand lightly on Shadow's shoulder. The old shepherd remained perfectly still, waiting, watching, listening. Together they moved toward the porch. Years of military training returned naturally. Quiet steps, controlled breathing, constant observation. The porch boards creaked beneath their weight. The open doorway waited. Dark, silent. Ethan slowly pushed the door wider. The living room came into view. Nothing appeared disturbed. The couch remained where he left it. The fireplace, the table, the lantern, everything looked normal, almost too normal. Shadow stepped inside first. His nose immediately went to work. Back and forth, across the floor, across the furniture, across the room. Then he stopped, growled softly. Not loud, not aggressive. A warning. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The hallway, the bedroom, the hidden compartment. Someone had gone directly there. The realization tightened his chest. He moved quickly. The bedroom door stood open. Inside, the floorboards remained lifted. The hidden compartment remained exposed. But something was different. The ammunition box sat crooked. Several journals lay scattered across the floor. Papers were missing. Not many, just enough. Someone had searched. Someone knew exactly what they wanted. Ethan knelt. His pulse accelerated. He examined the compartment carefully. The cassette tapes remained. Most of the journals remained. The photographs remained. But one folder was gone. A thick folder Harold had labeled land transfers. The most detailed collection of evidence. The most dangerous collection. Someone had taken it. The storm rattled the windows. Outside, darkness deepened. Inside, Ethan felt a familiar sensation. The mission had changed. Until now, he had been investigating the past. Now the past was fighting back. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears locked onto something outside. The dog sprinted toward the living room. Ethan followed immediately. A sound echoed through the storm. An engine. Close. Very close. Headlights suddenly flashed through the trees. Then disappeared, then returned. A vehicle moving near the property. The same black SUV. Ethan recognized it instantly. The vehicle stopped near the driveway entrance. Its headlights remained off, hidden, watching. Shadow's growl deepened. Every hair along his back stood upright. The old dog looked years younger. Pure working dog focus, pure protection. The SUV eventually backed away, disappearing into the snow. But the message was unmistakable. We know where you are. We know what you found. The storm worsened overnight. Wind battered the guest house. Snow piled against the walls. Neither Ethan nor Shadow slept much. The journals covered the kitchen table. Maps, photographs, records, questions. By midnight, Ethan had uncovered another piece of Harold's investigation. Several handwritten notes connected the stolen land directly to a series of shell corporations. Each corporation eventually led to one name: Wade Thornton. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The Thornton empire wasn't merely connected to Caleb's disappearance. It appeared to have benefited from it. A loud crash outside interrupted his thoughts. Shadow exploded to his feet. The dog raced toward the window. Ethan grabbed a flashlight. The noise had come from behind the house, near the shed. Snow blew violently through the darkness. Visibility was poor, yet something felt wrong, very wrong. Ethan opened the back door. The cold air hit him immediately. Shadow charged into the storm, without hesitation, without fear. Shadow! The dog ignored him. A rare occurrence. The old shepherd had locked onto something. Ethan followed. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The flashlight beam bounced across the darkness. Then he saw a movement, a figure, near the shed, someone dressed in dark winter clothing. The person immediately turned and ran. Another figure emerged from behind the trees, then another. 3 people, not random trespassers, not curious hikers. They moved with purpose. They had come for something, or perhaps to make sure something disappeared. Shadow barked furiously. The sound echoed across the valley. The nearest intruder sprinted toward the forest. Ethan started after him, then stopped. A second figure had moved toward the house, toward the evidence, toward Harold's journals. The decision took less than a second. Protect the evidence. Protect the mission. Shadow made the choice easier. The old shepherd launched forward, straight toward the second intruder. The figure stumbled backward, startled. Shadow struck with the speed of a dog half his age. The intruder fell into the snow. The struggle lasted only seconds. Then came a sound. Sharp, sudden, a single gunshot. The valley fell silent. Everything stopped. For one terrible moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. Shadow yelped. The sound cut straight through him. The dog collapsed into the snow. The intruders froze, then fled, running into the forest, disappearing into the storm. Ethan didn't chase them. Nothing mattered except Shadow. He reached the dog in seconds. The old shepherd lay on his side, breathing rapidly. Snow gathered across his fur. Blood stained the white ground beneath him. Ethan's world narrowed instantly. Training took over. Assessment, breathing, pressure, stabilization. The same procedures he'd performed countless times. Except this wasn't a teammate. This wasn't another soldier. This was Shadow, his partner, his family, his best friend. "Stay with me." His voice shook. Shadow's eyes remained open, focused, trusting. The wound appeared serious but survivable. The bullet had passed through the shoulder. Painful, dangerous, but not immediately fatal. Ethan removed his jacket, applied pressure, worked quickly. The storm howled around them. Snow continued falling. Time suddenly mattered. The nearest emergency veterinary clinic sat nearly 40 miles away, across mountain roads. During a blizzard, Ethan carefully lifted Shadow into the truck. The old shepherd whined softly, but never fought, never panicked. Even injured, the dog trusted him completely. The drive became a battle against weather. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Wind pushed against the truck. Ice covered sections of road. Yet Ethan never slowed. Every few minutes he reached across the seat, checking Shadow, talking to him, keeping him awake, keeping him fighting. "You don't quit on me." The dog opened one eye, listening. "You hear me?" Shadow's tail moved weakly. Once. That was enough. Hours later, the clinic finally appeared through the storm. Lights, warmth, help. Veterinarians rushed outside with a stretcher. Ethan followed them inside. The doors closed. The storm remained outside. The waiting began, and waiting was always harder. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. Ethan sat alone in the waiting room. Blood stained his hands. Blood stained his clothes. Memories returned. Hospital rooms. Linda's illness. The helplessness. The uncertainty. The fear. For the first time since arriving at Black Pine Hollow, he considered quitting. Maybe Harold had been wrong. Maybe the truth wasn't worth this price. Maybe some secrets should remain buried. The thought lingered. Then a veterinarian appeared. A tired smile crossed her face. "He's going to be okay." Relief hit Ethan so hard he nearly lost his balance. The tension left his body all at once. The room blurred briefly. The veterinarian continued. "The bullet missed anything critical. He lost blood, but he's strong." Strong, that word described Shadow perfectly. Strong, loyal, unbreakable. The old shepherd had nearly died protecting him, protecting Harold's evidence, protecting the truth. And suddenly, Ethan understood something. The attack itself was evidence. Nobody risks that much over a harmless story. Nobody sends people into a snowstorm to steal papers unless those papers matter. The attack proved Harold had been right all along. The truth was dangerous, because it was real. And somewhere beyond the storm, someone was terrified that Ethan Walker and his dog were getting too close to it. Very close. Closer than ever. And now there was no turning back. 3 days later, Ethan drove back into Black Pine Hollow. The storm had passed. Fresh snow covered the valley like a white blanket pulled across the mountains. The guest house stood exactly where he had left it. Silent, waiting. But everything felt different now. The attack had changed something. Not just the investigation. Him. The old certainty he had carried through military service had returned. The certainty that some missions mattered too much to abandon. Yet when he looked across the passenger seat, he felt the weight of doubt. Shadow wasn't there. The seat was empty. For the first time in years, the absence hit harder than Ethan expected. The veterinary clinic had insisted on keeping the dog for observation. The wound was healing well. The doctors were optimistic. But Shadow needed rest, and Ethan hated every mile he drove without him. The guest house felt strangely hollow, too quiet. The fire crackled in the fireplace. The evidence remained spread across the kitchen table. The journals, the maps, the photographs. Yet Ethan found himself staring at the empty rug where Shadow usually slept. The silence brought old memories. Linda. The hospital. The house after her funeral. Rooms that suddenly felt too large, too quiet, too permanent. That evening, Ethan opened one of Harold's final journals. The handwriting looked shakier than before. Age, illness, time. The entries carried a different tone, urgent, focused, as though Harold knew he was running out of opportunities. One passage immediately caught Ethan's attention. If anything happens to me before this is finished, there is one last place. The ridge above Black Pine Hollow, the place Caleb loved most, the place where truth still waits. Ethan sat upright, his pulse quickened. The entry continued. The map is hidden where only someone who truly understands loyalty would think to look. Shadow always found it. The words stopped him cold. Shadow always found it. Not a coincidence. Not a guess. Harold had known Shadow, or at least known dogs like him. Somehow the old rancher had designed everything around the instincts of a working dog. The realization felt almost unbelievable. Yet every clue had led through Shadow. Every discovery, every breakthrough, every answer. Ethan read the passage 3 times, then unfolded the attached sketch. A rough map, hand-drawn, simple. The route led toward the highest ridge overlooking the valley. A place marked only with 3 words, the Overlook. The next morning, Ethan packed supplies, snowshoes, water, food, a radio. The mountain weather looked stable. The hike would take several hours. As he stepped outside, his phone rang. The veterinarian. For one terrifying second, his heart stopped. Then he answered. The news was good. Shadow was improving. Walking again. Eating again. Complaining loudly whenever staff tried separating him from visitors. Ethan smiled for the first time in days. That sounded like Shadow. Before hanging up, the veterinarian said something unexpected. He keeps bringing us things. What? Blankets, shoes, tools, anything he can carry. Ethan laughed softly. The old dog had always assigned himself jobs. Apparently recovery wasn't enough. He needed a mission. The thought stayed with Ethan throughout the hike. The ridge towered above Black Pine Hollow. The climb became steeper as elevation increased. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Wind swept across exposed sections of rock. Far below, the valley looked small, forgotten, beautiful. By midday, he reached the overlook. The view stole his breath. Mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Forests blanketed the slopes. Frozen rivers cut silver lines through the landscape. And standing alone near the cliff's edge was a stone marker. Simple, weathered, almost hidden beneath snow. Ethan approached slowly. No name appeared on the front, no dates, only 4 words. For the man who stayed true, a chill moved through him. This wasn't a grave, not exactly. It was a memorial, a secret one, built by someone who remembered, someone who refused to forget. Ethan brushed snow away from the base, then noticed something unusual. Fresh scratches, deep grooves in the stone, not made by weather, not made recently, made by claws, dog claws. The realization struck instantly. Shadow. This was what Harold meant. The old shepherd had somehow discovered this place before. Maybe years earlier. Maybe during visits with Harold. The thought seemed impossible. Yet the evidence sat directly in front of him. Ethan circled the memorial, then spotted a narrow metal box hidden beneath a loose stone. His pulse quickened. Another cache. Another secret. Another piece of Harold's mission. The box opened easily. Inside lay a small digital recorder, several sealed envelopes, and final journal, the last journal, Harold's final words. Ethan sat against the stone marker. Wind moved softly through the pines below. Cloud shadows drifted across distant peaks. The world seemed impossibly still. He pressed play on the recorder. Static filled the air. Then Harold's voice emerged, older, weaker, but unmistakable. Hello, Ethan. The sound froze him. It felt like hearing a ghost. If you're listening to this, then Shadow got you here. A long pause followed, then a faint chuckle. I figured he would. Ethan stared across the mountains, listening. You're probably wondering why I left everything to you. The wind whispered through the trees. Because I knew you wouldn't quit. Another pause. I watched what happened after Linda died. Ethan's throat tightened. You kept going when most men would have given up. Harold coughed. The recording crackled. And I knew a Navy SEAL, and his dog would finish what I couldn't. Ethan closed his eyes. The words hit harder than expected. Harold continued. Caleb never stopped fighting. The voice grew softer. He lost his land, lost his reputation, lost his home. A long silence followed. Then came the sentence that changed everything. But he never lost the truth. Ethan opened his eyes. The mountains suddenly seemed closer. The recorder continued. The people who framed him were powerful. Another cough. They threatened witnesses, buried records, bought silence. The wind intensified. The recording crackled again. But I found enough. Harold's voice strengthened slightly. Enough to prove what happened. Then came the final revelation. I didn't hide this evidence because I was afraid. A pause. I hid it because I needed time. Another pause. I was waiting for the right people. Ethan stared at the recorder. The right people. Plural. Then Harold answered the question. You, a breath. And Shadow. The old rancher's voice softened. Dogs know things men ignore. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The recorder continued. If you're hearing this, then he did his job. The wind carried silence across the ridge. Then Harold spoke one final time. Finish it. Click. The recording ended. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move. The mountains stood silent around him. The memorial stood silent beside him. Everything Harold had done suddenly made sense. The guest house, the hidden room, the clues, the maps, the evidence. The old rancher hadn't simply left an inheritance. He had built a mission. A decades-long mission designed for one final team. A retired SEAL and a retired military dog. The realization settled heavily. Then Ethan opened the final journal. Inside he found something even more shocking. Not just evidence, names, witnesses, former officials. People who knew pieces of the truth. People still alive. People who could finally speak. The list changed everything. This wasn't just history anymore. It was a case. A real case. A living case. And for the first time in 40 years, the people responsible had reason to be afraid. Far below, Black Pine Hollow rested beneath winter sunlight. The guest house looked tiny from this height. Yet Ethan understood something now. The abandoned house had never been the inheritance. The evidence wasn't the inheritance. Even the truth wasn't the inheritance. Purpose was. And for the first time since losing Linda, Ethan Walker felt purpose again. A mission worth finishing. A reason to keep moving forward. And waiting for him back at the veterinary clinic was the partner who had made all of it possible. The dog who refused to quit. The dog who had led him to every answer. The dog who had nearly given his life protecting the truth, Shadow. And together, they were about to bring 40 years of lies into the light. The veterinary clinic sat beneath a pale winter sky. Snow covered the parking lot. Wind pushed loose powder across the pavement in soft waves. Ethan stepped through the front doors, carrying Harold's final journal beneath his arm. A veterinary technician smiled immediately. Someone's been waiting for you. Before Ethan could answer, a familiar bark echoed down the hallway. Then came the sound of claws scraping against tile. Seconds later, Shadow appeared. The old German shepherd moved slower than before. A bandage covered his shoulder. His gait wasn't perfect, but his eyes were bright. His tail wagged, and for Ethan that was enough. The dog crossed the room and leaned heavily against him. Not because he needed support, because he was happy. Because after everything that had happened, they were together again. Ethan knelt carefully. His hand rested against Shadow's neck. For a long moment neither moved. The clinic around them disappeared. The investigations disappeared. The lies disappeared. There was only gratitude. The veterinarian eventually joined them. He's tougher than most people. Ethan smiled. I know. The doctor glanced toward the journal under Ethan's arm. Whatever you're doing out there, be careful. The warning sounded simple, but something in her voice suggested she understood more than she was saying. Maybe news had already started spreading. Maybe rumors were beginning to move through Silver Creek. Small towns had a way of knowing things before newspapers did. By afternoon, Ethan and Shadow were back at the guest house. The valley looked different now, not because the landscape had changed, because Ethan had changed. The pieces finally fit together. Harold's evidence, the witness list, the land transfers, the hidden records, the memorial, the attack. The truth had reached a point where it could no longer remain buried. Now it needed a voice, a public voice, someone capable of putting everything into the open. That evening, Ethan made a phone call. One name from Harold's final journal stood apart from the others. Claire Dawson, investigative journalist. Denver, independent, relentless. Harold had written only one sentence beside her name. If anyone can finish this story, it's Claire. The call lasted nearly an hour. At first, she sounded skeptical, then curious, then silent. As Ethan described the evidence, the hidden compartments, the journals, and the attack, Claire stopped interrupting. By the end, she asked only one question. "Do you still have everything? Most of it?" "Good." A pause followed. Then she said something that surprised him. "I'm driving up tomorrow." The next afternoon, Claire Dawson arrived in Black Pine Hollow. She looked nothing like Ethan expected. No expensive clothes, no television makeup, no entourage. Just a woman in her early 40s carrying notebooks, cameras, and an expression that suggested she trusted evidence more than people. The moment she entered the guest house, she went to work. Photographs, documents, maps, journals, property records, Harold's recordings, everything. For 10 hours, she reviewed material without stopping. Shadow followed her constantly, watching, observing. At one point, she laughed. "I think your dog is fact-checking me." Shadow remained perfectly serious. The next morning, she started making calls. Then more calls. Then dozens more. Former ranchers, retired officials, neighbors, witnesses, family members. People who had stayed silent for decades. Something remarkable happened. The moment Claire began asking questions backed by actual evidence, people started talking. Not everyone, but enough. An elderly ranch hand admitted he had witnessed strange property transfers in the early 1980s. A retired surveyor revealed that several official boundary maps had been altered after submission. A former county employee remembered documents disappearing from archives. Small pieces, scattered pieces. Yet together they formed a picture, and the picture was ugly. Very ugly. Within a week, Claire's article was ready. The headline appeared online early Friday morning. "The Silver Creek Secret. Did a Colorado fortune begin with stolen land?" By noon, thousands had read it. By evening, tens of thousands. By the next morning, television stations picked up the story. Then radio, then larger newspapers. The reaction exploded. Silver Creek woke up inside a storm far more powerful than any mountain blizzard. At the diner, people whispered. At church, conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. At grocery stores, residents gathered in small groups around printed copies of the article. For the first time in 40 years, people were asking questions, real questions. The kind Harold had spent decades trying to force people to ask. Shadow sat beside Ethan in the guest house as they watched the coverage unfold. News vans began appearing in town. Reporters arrived. State officials issued statements. County offices received requests for records. The silence surrounding Caleb Thornton's disappearance finally shattered. Then came the first major breakthrough. A retired deputy sheriff named Frank Delaney contacted Claire. He was 82 years old, living alone outside Pueblo, and carrying a secret. The interview lasted 3 hours. Claire recorded every word. Frank admitted that during the original investigation, he had been instructed to stop asking questions about Caleb Thornton. Certain files disappeared. Certain reports vanished. Certain witnesses were never interviewed. At the time, he convinced himself there was probably an explanation. Now, he wasn't so sure. His testimony changed everything, because for the first time, someone connected directly to the original events had gone on record, publicly. The pressure intensified. State investigators announced they would review historical property records. Several attorneys offered assistance. Former residents began sharing stories online. The wall of silence developed cracks. Then came another surprise. One afternoon, while Ethan was organizing evidence, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Shadow immediately rose, alert, watching. A man stepped out. late 60s, gray hair, expensive coat, nervous eyes. Ethan recognized him from old photographs. Roy Thornton, Wade Thornton's older cousin. The man approached slowly, hands visible, expression weary. "I need to talk." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Roy revealed something astonishing. For decades, he had suspected the family's wealth came from something dishonest. He never had proof, only rumors, fragments, whispers. Now, after reading Claire's article, he believed Harold had been right. Before leaving, Roy handed Ethan a small notebook, his father's notebook, personal records, private conversations, business meetings, names, dates, transactions, more evidence, more confirmation, another crack in the wall. That evening, Claire called again. Her voice carried excitement. State investigators just opened a formal inquiry. Ethan looked toward Shadow. The old shepherd rested beside the fireplace. His injured shoulder was healing slowly, steadily, like everything else in this story. The dog lifted his head, their eyes met. For a moment, Ethan thought about the first day, the laughter in the lawyer's office, the worthless guest house, the rusted key, the note, "Trust the dog." He understood now. Harold had never left him a house. He had left him a path, and Shadow had found every step. Outside, snow drifted through Black Pine Hollow. Inside, the truth continued spreading. Across Colorado, across newspapers, across television screens, across conversations, across lives. And somewhere beyond the mountains, Wade Thornton sat inside an empire that was beginning to shake beneath him. Not because of accusations, not because of rumors, because facts were finally catching up. The kind of facts that survive decades. The kind of facts Harold Walker spent 40 years protecting. The kind of facts powerful people fear most. The truth. And now the entire state was listening. Spring arrived slowly in the Rockies. Snow retreated from the lower valleys first. The creeks began running again. Patches of green returned to the hillsides, and across Colorado, the story refused to fade. Every week brought new headlines, new interviews, new evidence, new questions. The investigation that began inside a forgotten guest house had become impossible to ignore. For Ethan Walker, the attention felt strange. For years, he had lived almost invisibly. A homeless veteran, a man sleeping in his truck, a man most people overlooked. Now reporters called daily. Attorneys requested meetings. State investigators wanted access to Harold's records. Yet Ethan avoided the spotlight whenever possible. The story was never about him. It was about Caleb Thornton, the man who had vanished, the man everyone had judged, the man almost everyone had forgotten. One April morning, Ethan received a call from Claire Dawson. Her voice sounded different, not excited, not angry, almost stunned. "Ethan, I think we found her." He immediately sat upright. "Found who?" A pause, then 2 words. "Caleb's daughter." The room fell silent. Shadow lifted his head from beside the fireplace. Almost as if he understood, Claire explained quickly. A genealogist helping with the investigation had followed old census records, marriage records, property filings, school documents. The trail eventually led to Oregon, to a woman named Rebecca Thornton Hayes, age 62, retired school principal, the last known surviving child of Caleb Thornton. For several moments, Ethan couldn't speak. The idea felt unreal. After 40 years, after all the lies, after all the silence, someone from Caleb's family was still alive, still waiting without knowing she was waiting. 3 weeks later, Rebecca arrived in Silver Creek. The meeting took place at the guest house, the same guest house where everything had begun. The valley was bright with spring sunlight. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing ground. The mountains still carried snow near their peaks, but life had returned. A silver rental car appeared near noon. Rebecca stepped out slowly. She looked remarkably like Caleb, the same eyes, the same posture, the same quiet strength visible in old photographs. For a moment, she simply stood there staring at the guest house, at the porch, at the valley, at the mountains her father had once loved. Emotion moved across her face. Disbelief, sadness, hope, all at once. Ethan walked toward her. Neither knew what to say. How do you greet someone connected to 40 years of unfinished history? Fortunately, Shadow solved the problem. The old German shepherd approached gently. No barking, no hesitation. Rebecca immediately knelt. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched his fur. Something unexpected happened. Tears filled her eyes. "I've seen pictures of him." She smiled through the emotion. "My father loved dogs." Shadow rested his head against her shoulder. The gesture seemed small, yet Ethan felt it change everything. The years, the distance, the loss. For the first time, Caleb Thornton's family was connected again to the truth. Inside the guest house, Rebecca spent hours reviewing Harold's evidence. Photographs, journals, letters, maps, the hidden history of her father's life. Often she cried quietly. Sometimes she laughed. Other times she simply stared at the pages in silence. One photograph affected her more than any other. Caleb standing beside Harold at the edge of a cattle pasture. Both smiling, both young, both believing the future belonged to them. Rebecca held the picture carefully. "My father kept one exactly like this." Ethan looked up. What happened to him? The question lingered. Rebecca stared out the window before answering. "For most of my life, I believed he abandoned us." The words came slowly, painfully. "As a little girl, that's what everyone told me." She paused. "My mother believed it too." The room remained silent. Then one night, years later, he came back. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Rebecca nodded. "He found us in Oregon." The revelation stunned him. Caleb hadn't vanished forever. He had survived. The story wasn't over. It had simply continued somewhere else. Rebecca explained everything. Years after disappearing, Caleb had secretly contacted his family. Not because he wanted to stay away, because he was terrified. According to Rebecca, he believed powerful people would destroy anyone connected to him. He thought distance was the only protection he could offer. So he remained hidden, working odd jobs, moving frequently, living quietly, watching from afar, never fully trusting anyone again. The tragedy settled heavily over the room. Caleb had survived, but survival came at a terrible cost. He never returned to Colorado, never reclaimed his land, never cleared his name. And according to Rebecca, he died 10 years earlier, believing the truth would remain buried forever. Shadow slowly approached. The old shepherd rested his head in her lap. Rebecca broke down completely. Years of grief surfaced at once. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. The grief of a daughter realizing her father had been telling the truth all along. The grief of lost decades, lost opportunities, lost time. Ethan looked away, giving her privacy, because some moments belonged only to family. Later that afternoon, another surprise arrived. State investigators released preliminary findings. The evidence overwhelmingly supported Harold's claims. Property fraud, document manipulation, improper transfers, questionable corporate structures. Nothing had reached final conclusions yet. But the direction was obvious. The Thornton empire was in trouble, real trouble. Meanwhile, Wade Thornton remained almost completely silent. Public appearances stopped. Interviews stopped. Statements became rare. The powerful rancher who once dominated every room now seemed to be shrinking from view. One evening, Claire called again. "Wade's lenders are pulling back." Ethan listened quietly. Several business partners, too. The empire wasn't collapsing overnight, but cracks had become visible, and once cracks appear, people begin asking questions. The following week brought another unexpected visitor. Pastor Samuel Grant, the oldest minister in Silver Creek, 81 years old, retired, respected by everyone. He arrived carrying a worn leather Bible and a folder. The pastor sat on the porch overlooking the valley. For a long time he simply watched the mountains. Then he spoke. "I owe Caleb Thornton an apology." The words surprised Ethan. Pastor Grant explained that decades earlier, he had believed the accusations. Most people had. The evidence seemed convincing. The rumors seemed credible. Questioning them felt unnecessary. "I never asked whether it was true." His voice carried regret. "I only asked whether it was believable." The distinction mattered, more than ever. Before leaving, the pastor handed Ethan the folder. Inside were old church records, meeting notes, community correspondence, additional evidence supporting Caleb's reputation. More pieces, more confirmation, more truth. That night, Ethan sat on the porch beside Shadow. Stars filled the mountain's sky. The valley rested quietly below. For the first time since arriving in Black Pine Hollow, he felt something unexpected. Peace, not because the battle was over, because the truth no longer stood alone. Rebecca knew, Claire knew, investigators knew, witnesses knew. The community was beginning to know, and somewhere beyond the mountains, Caleb Thornton's name was finally being restored. The old shepherd leaned against Ethan's leg. His shoulder had healed remarkably well. The scar remained, a permanent reminder, a reminder of loyalty, of sacrifice, of purpose. Ethan looked toward the dark outline of the mountains, then down at Shadow. The dog had found the wall, found the compartment, found the clues, found the ridge, found the mission. Without him, none of this would have happened. Without him, Caleb Thornton might have remained forgotten forever. The old dog closed his eyes, content, at peace, and for the first time in 40 years, so was the memory of the man everyone had misjudged. The criminal was innocent. The missing man had been betrayed. The truth was finally winning. And beyond the horizon, one final chapter still waited, the chapter where healing would begin. 1 year later, summer sunlight poured across Black Pine Hollow. The valley no longer looked abandoned. The broken porch had been rebuilt. Fresh paint covered the weathered siding. Wildflowers lined the gravel driveway. The old guest house stood proudly beneath the Colorado sky, as if it had finally remembered what it was meant to be. The transformation had taken months, not because Ethan Walker wanted luxury, because he wanted purpose. The same purpose Harold Walker had left behind. The same purpose Caleb Thornton had been denied. The same purpose Shadow had nearly given his life protecting. A wooden sign now stood near the entrance road. Simple, handcrafted, honest. Walker Retreat, for veterans and retired working dogs people. Came from all over the state. Former soldiers, retired military handlers, veterans struggling to reconnect with civilian life, men and women carrying burdens few others understood. Some stayed for a weekend, others stayed for months. The mountains helped, the silence helped, the community helped. But most of all, the retreat gave people something many thought they had lost forever: belonging. On a warm July morning, Ethan stood on the porch watching the valley wake up. A golden sunrise spilled across the peaks. The creek shimmered below. Birdsong drifted through the trees. For the first time in many years, the future felt larger than the past. Shadow rested beside him, older now, a little slower, the scar on his shoulder visible beneath his fur, but still strong, still proud, still watching everything. The old German shepherd had become something of a legend. Visitors knew his story, veterans especially. Many arrived specifically hoping to meet him. The dog always accepted attention politely, then returned to work, because in Shadow's mind, retirement was apparently optional. Loyalty wasn't. A pickup truck rolled into the driveway. Ethan recognized it immediately. Rebecca Hayes, Caleb Thornton's daughter. She visited often now, sometimes for a day, sometimes longer. The valley had become important to her. A connection to a father she was still learning to know. She stepped out carrying a framed photograph. The same photograph Ethan had found in Harold's hidden cache. Caleb and Harold standing together beside a cattle fence. Young, hopeful, unaware of what the future would bring. Rebecca joined Ethan on the porch. For a while, neither spoke. The mountains filled the silence. Finally, she smiled. "You know, my father would have loved this place." Ethan nodded. "I think so too." She looked toward the retreat, toward the cabins, toward the veterans walking trails through the pines, toward the dogs running freely in the fields. "More than that," she said softly. "I think he would have been proud." The words landed heavily, not because Ethan needed praise, because he understood who the praise belonged to. Harold, Shadow, Caleb, all of them. This place existed because none of them had surrendered. Later that afternoon, a dedication ceremony gathered near the creek. Nothing elaborate. Just people, veterans, families, neighbors, friends. The sort of gathering Harold would have appreciated. Simple, authentic, real. A memorial wall had been constructed beside the main lodge. Natural stone from the surrounding mountains. Bronze plaques mounted carefully across its surface. One honored Harold Walker, the man who protected the truth for 40 years. Another honored Caleb Thornton, the man whose name had finally been restored. And another honored military working dogs, the loyal partners who carried burdens alongside the people they served. At the center sat a photograph of Shadow, taken by Claire Dawson during the investigation. The old shepherd standing in front of the guest house, alert, focused, unwavering, exactly as everyone remembered him. Claire attended the ceremony as well. The journalist who helped bring everything into the light. Her reporting had won awards. State investigations eventually confirmed much of Harold's evidence. Property settlements followed. Several historical records were corrected. Official acknowledgments were issued. Not everything could be repaired. 40 years leaves permanent scars, but truth finally stood where lies once lived. And sometimes that was enough. As evening approached, the crowd gradually dispersed. Vehicles departed. Voices faded. The valley returned to quiet, the way it always did. Ethan remained near the memorial wall. Shadow lay beside him. The old dog's head rested comfortably on his paws. The mountains glowed orange beneath the setting sun. For a long time, Ethan simply stood there, thinking, remembering. A year earlier, he had arrived at a law office carrying everything he owned in a pickup truck. Homeless, grieving, directionless. Most people had laughed. Most people saw a broken veteran inheriting a worthless house. They never saw the mission. Neither had he. Not yet. The laughter no longer bothered him, because now he understood what Harold had truly left behind. Not money, not property, not evidence. Purpose, the most valuable inheritance of all. Shadow slowly rose. The old shepherd walked toward the memorial wall, toward Caleb's plaque, toward Harold's plaque. Then toward his own photograph. He sat there quietly, watching, as if conducting one final inspection. Ethan smiled. Everything looks good? Shadow glanced back. His tail moved once. The same answer he had given 100 times. The same answer that had guided them through every chapter of the journey. The sun slipped lower. Golden light spread across Black Pine Hollow. The valley seemed almost unreal, peaceful, whole, healed. Ethan sat beside the dog. Together they watched the sunset, the same way they had watched storms, the same way they had watched mountains, the same way they had watched truth slowly emerge from darkness. Eventually, Rebecca joined them. Then Claire, then several veterans staying at the retreat. No speeches, no ceremonies, just people sitting together beneath the Colorado sky, connected by stories, connected by sacrifice, connected by hope. The way communities are supposed to be. The first stars appeared overhead. The air cooled. The creek continued its endless journey through the valley, and Ethan realized something simple. Harold had never left him a guest house. Harold had left him a reason to keep going, a reason to wake up, a reason to believe that even after loss, purpose could return. Even after grief, healing could happen. Even after 40 years of lies, truth could still find its way home. Beside him, Shadow rested peacefully. Older, wiser, still loyal, always loyal. The dog who found the wall. The dog who found the evidence. The dog who found the mission. The dog who carried the truth farther than fear ever could. Darkness settled gently across the valley. The lights of the retreat glowed warmly among the trees. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Walker no longer felt homeless. He was exactly where he belonged, home. Because some lies survive for decades, some wounds survive even longer, but loyalty survives everything. And sometimes all it takes to uncover the truth is one forgotten key, one determined veteran, and one good dog who refuses to stop searching. The end. If you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, type yes in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when everyone else doubted you, let us know where you're watching from. In a world full of shortcuts, loyalty and perseverance still matter. If stories about justice, dignity, and order in people doing the right thing mean something to you, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next journey.